The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to this International Solar Alliance Expert Training course. This is part 2 of session 6, focusing specifically on policy called net billing. The first component on part 1 was covering net metering and provided an overview of the history and a bit more background on why net metering policies are changing, and it made frequent reference to policies like net billing, which are a step further in terms of the evolution of net metering, as we will see. So this session focuses specifically and provides a deeper look at how net billing policies work, why they differ, and what are the drivers behind them being adopted for rooftop or customer-sited solar. A quick word about the supporters of this training series. This is part of a joint collaboration between the International Solar Alliance, which is a grouping of solar resource-rich countries from around the world, and the Clean Energy Solutions Center, one of the leading institutions supporting capacity building and providing no-cost expert assistance to governments around the world on clean energy policy topics. This is part of Module 1 on policies for distributed solar PV, and it focuses again specifically on the issue of net billing. And as I pointed out, this is part 2 of a 2-part series. So this is a quick overview of the presentation. First, we'll have a look at the learning objective, the core of the presentation on net billing, a few concluding comments, and at the end there will also be a series of multiple choice questions to evaluate your knowledge and your grasp of the material. So without further ado, let's get started. So the learning objectives. First and foremost, to understand the rise of net billing. What is net billing and why is it emerging in different jurisdictions? How does it differ from what we typically know and refer to as net metering? It'll also ideally help you understand how net billing has been adapted to different jurisdictions around the world. So net billing in Pacific Islands versus in the Caribbean versus in different parts of the US and Europe. And you'll understand a little bit more about the advantages and challenges of this particular policy tool. In contrast to net metering, which was first adopted in the 1980s, net billing is a more recent policy innovation, and it emerged first in the 2000s in island regions. Similar to net metering, customers export their net excess generation to the grid and receive a compensation for that on their future power bill. So they get a credit on their bill. The main difference between net metering and net billing is the rate that's applied to that net excess generation. In particular, the rate at which customer-sited generation is credited is, in the case of net billing, different from the rate that customers actually pay. So if you've listened to the net metering presentation, you'll recall that under net metering, the rate that customers receive for their net excess generation, for their credits, is effectively the same rate as the retail rate they pay. This means that a residential customer gets a certain rate, a commercial customer will technically get a different rate, and an industrial customer would get a further different rate for their net excess generation. Net billing separates those two and makes the consumption rate, or the compensation rate rather, different from the actual rate that you pay. So if you are an electricity customer in Gujarat in India, or in Bangkok in Thailand, or in Johannesburg in South Africa, your rate that you pay is is different, let's say it's 15 cents or 18 cents or 12 cents per kilowatt hour, your net billing rate will differ from that and will typically, in most cases, be lower than that. And again, there's a number of reasons why the rate is being set at a lower level, and we'll get into that over the course of the presentation. Here's a quick diagram from a recent NREL report that provides a snapshot of how net billing works. I've provided the link here at the bottom. It's a fantastic report providing an overview of compensation mechanisms and the mechanics behind net metering and net billing policies. And this diagram gives you a clear visual showing how it works in practice. The formula for net billing differs from that for net metering. So if you recall from net metering, the compensation rate was equal to the retail rate. But with net billing, the compensation rate is some separate predetermined rate. That's not the rate that you pay. Excess electricity is injected into the grid and offsets your bill at that net billing rate. However, it's critical to point out net billing doesn't also is similar to net metering in this regard, in that it does not involve a cash payment. In most cases, net billing policies are just a billing mechanism. The utility will not write you a check. If they did, it would be called what we call a net fit, a hybrid between a net metering policy and a feed-in tariff that actually offers a cash payment for your net excess generation. So what really makes net billing different is that the rate at which you're erasing your own power bill is different from the retail rate you pay. And we'll see some examples of that in practice. So in that sense, net billing is fundamentally a variation on an accounting mechanism. You can offset your rate for each kilowatt hour you inject into the grid at some specified rate. So in this case, in the example, at say 7 cents per kilowatt hour. You may pay 10 cents for your electricity from the utility per kilowatt hour, but for your net excess generation, you would only get paid in this case, or you would only get compensated at 7 cents. So if you had a bill at the end of the month of say $50, every net excess kilowatt hour that you injected would reduce your bill by 7 cents per kilowatt hour, instead of erasing it at a rate of 10 cents per kilowatt hour under classic net metering. So in that sense, net billing severs the relationship between the value of a kilowatt hour consumed from the grid and the value of a kilowatt hour that a customer injects into the grid. So it creates a new accounting mechanism that's no longer connected directly to the retail rate you pay. And that's really the fundamental difference. In some cases, net billing can even be structured more conservatively than that. In some cases, the net billing rate, the full output of the PV system is injected into the grid. So essentially there's no net billing, or no self-consumption rather, but the net billing rate will apply not only to the electricity that you inject, it will also apply to the electricity that you consume. So in other words, you are not, under some variations of net billing, you are not able to self-consume your own electricity. They will take your full consumption, the utility will look at it, and they'll look at your production, and then they will use your production to erase your consumption bill at a separate rate, at some fixed rate. But you're not able to get the full retail rate value for even your own customer-sided generation. And these net billing variations are sometimes called buy-all, sell-all arrangements. And they get a bit technical, and there's some nuances here between net billing and a buy-all and sell-all. And this remains fairly unusual, fairly uncommon that net billing policies are structured this way, but it indicates a further variation on, again, this rapidly evolving landscape of policies to govern distributed renewable energy development. The net billing rate can be defined in a range of different ways. As you can see here in red, the net billing rate is typically lower than the rate paid by the customer. That's really one of the basic features of net billing. But what that rate actually is differs widely in a number of different jurisdictions. So it can be the wholesale market rate. It can be the time of use rate. In some cases, that time of use rate may be higher or lower. It can be the avoided cost rate of the utility. So what is the utility's average cost of generation? A fourth option is the value of solar rate, which is a calculation that is used to estimate what the actual value of that distributed solar is to the power system. Or it can simply be some other rate as set by the regulator. So it gets fairly complicated to really consider the different methodologies behind setting this alternate net billing rate. But you can see here there are different variations, and different regulators will use different arguments to justify having chosen one benchmark over the other. The core idea is that in jurisdictions with fairly high retail prices, it may be considered to be overcompensating the solar customer if you pay them or you compensate them at the whole full retail rate for their generation. So if you're in an island in the Caribbean or in the Pacific, for example, your actual retail rate may be 30, 40 cents per kilowatt hour or even more. And under that context, if you were able to erase your own consumption and get compensated for your net excess at the full retail rate, the utility argues that that's overcompensating the customer and that that's too profitable, and therefore they should be paying or compensating at some lower rate. And that's where net billing emerged. And now you're seeing a number of variations looking at these different compensation structures. Perhaps the most common is number 3, using the avoided cost rate as a benchmark for compensating net excess generation. The argument there being that it is then revenue neutral in theory to the utility. So if you have a certain amount of net excess generation, the utility can pay you its average blended, its average cost of generation, and that is what you will get compensated at, so that the utility is effectively revenue neutral for the net excess generation. This is actually the approach used currently in the Philippines, where the net billing rate is effectively set at the average blended utility generation cost across the system. Number 5 is also quite common. It's essentially just some other rate, and we see a number of jurisdictions where that's the case. This diagram provides a snapshot of how this looks in practice. You can see here the production profile, the consumption from the grid during the evening hours. When there's too much solar production during the day, it gets poured into the evening hours or into the next day and is used to offset. Now, the difference with net billing is, again, that the rate is some separate rate, not simply the net metering, or the retail rate that a customer pays. In order to really understand how net billing, or how these what are sometimes called self-consumption policies actually work, it's useful to look at this graphically. So on the left here, you can see a residential solar customer. And you can see here roughly the amount that they self-consume versus the amount that they inject into the grid. A standard household customer will have a fairly low self-consumption ratio because most people aren't home during the day or have very limited power demand during the day. And during the day when the sun is shining, that means most of the power from the solar system is being injected into the grid. So this means that residential customers are actually erasing fairly little of their consumption for the grid and are more dependent on what the rate is for their net excess, because residential customers will have much more net excess generation than a commercial customer will on average in most cases. So the logic there makes essentially the residential customer more exposed to whatever that net billing or net metering rate is. Commercial customers, on the other hand, like a supermarket, for example, will have a fairly high self-consumption ratio. That's because they have a high demand and a fairly stable demand over the course of a given week or month. And that means they're consuming most of the solar power on their rooftop, as long as the system is dimensioned in some way closely to their actual power demand. So this means that a commercial customer is less exposed or less reliant on the net billing rate than the residential customer in this case. Under net billing, you can see here the value of that net excess generation is decoupled from the retail tariffs. So in most cases, this green component here is what customers are self-consuming. So they're reducing their consumption to the grid. That is being valued at the full rate that they pay. And for the grid injection, they're getting something else. So if your retail rate, let's say, is 15 cents, that's what your green component is being valued at. And if the net billing rate is, say, 10 cents, that's what your grid injection is being valued at. So there are two different rates being applied, and you're being compensated differently for your self-consumption versus your grid injection. One fundamental consequence of this is that it tends to encourage higher self-consumption ratios. It encourages households, for example, to get smarter appliances that they can turn on during the day. It may make sense to wait until the morning to turn your dishwasher on or your clothes washing machine. It may also encourage businesses to get smarter about shifting more of their demand needs to the daytime as well, to the extent that they can. So there are different incentives and sort of behavioral consequences of different tariff and policy designs. And you can see here, I think we're just at the beginning, in the sense of really understanding how complex these behavioral dynamics can be, with both net metering, net billing, and now net fit policies, all of the tax implications and new business models that are emerging on top. It makes this a very dynamic and in many ways, a very exciting space to be involved in and to watch. So if we look at this a little more closely, for grid injection, typically under net metering, this is compensated at the full retail rate, or under net billing, it's compensated at a separate rate. For self-consumption, as we saw, it can offset the full retail rate, which is again the case in most net metering and net billing policies, or even the self-consumption can be offset at some separate rate. And that effectively involves the utility getting between the customer and their own solar system. And that's what we saw in the case of these buy all, sell all arrangements, where effectively the customer is obligated to sell all of their power to the utility, and the utility takes that power and then uses it to reduce the bill of the customer at some separate rate. So this is just to essentially reiterate, the net billing rate can be applied in two ways: for all customer-sided generation, purely as a ex post or after the fact bill adjustment, or it can be applied strictly to the net excess generation. And those two variations have very important differences for how attractive the overall policy landscape is. So a quick overview here, just to, again, this session was billed as a deep dive session, so you do need to work through some of the nuances and hopefully can appreciate why, at the end of this, why these different policy designs matter, why the differences are really important, and why we're seeing so much innovation and dynamism in this particular policy space. So this table tries to synthesize what we've said so far. The four different policy mechanisms on the left: net metering, net billing, and net fit, which you'll see in session 7, and a classic fit, which is featured in another session of this expert training series. The relation to the retail rate under net metering, as we saw, is at the retail rate. The compensation under net billing is below the retail rate. In net fits, it's also typically below the retail rate, although there was the first arguably net fit policy was launched in Australia in the 2000s. And at that time, Australia, they called it a feed-in tariff, but essentially it was a net feed-in tariff, because they were only paying the feed-in tariff for the net injection into the grid. For everything else, you were just wiping out your own bill. But in Australia, the net fit rate was above the retail rate. So it was much more attractive to maximize your grid injection, not your self-consumption ratio. The classic fit has no relation to the retail rate. It's set at the levelized cost of energy of each technology. So that's really the key. Those are the key differences. And on the far right, you can see here whether there's a possibility of cash payment or not. Net metering, traditionally not. Net billing either. But under both a net fit or a classic fit, yes, there is a cash payment. And again, this has a fundamental impact on how bankable, how financially attractive it is to invest in a distributed solar or distributed renewable energy project. Many banks are hesitant to lend to projects, to net metering projects, or even worse, net billing projects, because they don't really see a clear cash flow. And it's fundamentally reliant on the creditworthiness or solvency of the owner of the system. So often the system needs to be collateralized in part, if not in full, and in many cases, net metering and net billing projects are financed largely with cash, people's own equity, or directly on the balance sheet out of operating income. So the dynamic there is fundamentally different. Under a feed-in tariff, by contrast, or a net fit even, it's possible or typically easier to go to a bank and actually get a loan, which can arguably make it easier for a wider number of customers to participate. As we saw a moment ago, in a way, net billing is a more conservative, a more restrictive policy than a classic net metering, and that's why there's so many battles going on, particularly across the US. The battles are probably most heated in different US states and regulatory commissions, public utility commissions, and part of the deeper shift that's happening here is one towards something like net billing, and that's what many solar energy advocates and solar industry representatives have been fighting against. They argue that getting a full retail rate is the way it should be, because that's the way it's always been, and they fight any change to that. In other jurisdictions that have less of a history with net metering, governments or regulators are starting by implementing a net billing, so customers have never really known a full net metering policy, and there's nothing to then fight to protect, because they went straight to a net billing. Now, in addition to the net billing rate being set, there's additional restrictions that can be added to further tighten the screws and further protect, for example, the utility against revenue erosion. This is really where we see the battle lines being drawn between the different camps. The regulator, in some cases, can limit which components of the actual power bill can be erased with your own customer-cited generation. So in some cases, they will ring fence certain components or introduce what are called non-bypassable charges, or what are sometimes called minimum bills, where essentially that means if you are a customer of this utility, you have a minimum bill or a minimum contribution of $15, $20, $30 to the utility every month, just because of the fact that you are connected as a utility customer. And then everything above that is based on your consumption and your demand essentially. But that minimum bill, or that ring-fenced component of the bill, is a fixed amount that cannot be erased, no matter how big your solar system is. So you could have a whole bunch of net excess generation credits, but it will not erase that basic ring-fenced revenue component. And that's, again, the product of the battle between utilities and the solar customers, or solar industry in a way, where the utility says we need to be protected against revenue erosion and against cross-subsidization. So they introduce these different kinds of regulatory mechanisms. This gets into a series of rate design considerations. There is a separate training in this training session, in this series of training modules looking specifically at rate design. So if you're interested in taking a deeper dive and looking more into how all of these different solar policies connect to utility rate making and rate design, then have a look at that that session, and you'll find a lot more information and insights there. Much like net metering, there are different rollover provisions. Customers can typically bank their excess generation also up to 12 months, and they can use those credits, just like net metering, to offset in future months. However, after the 12-month settlement period, for example, in this case, excess credits would be credited to the customer at the net billing rate. So let's say if it's 7 cents per kilowatt hour, that's what the customer would get credited. And in some cases, they even offer, under some net billing policies, they'll say, okay, we'll pay you a little bit for that net excess at the end, which technically could make the policy considered a net fit, but that's somehow, it's a bit different from a net fit, where a net fit is a guaranteed payment for all of the net excess generation in every billing cycle. So every month you would get a check. Under these net billing variations, it's only at the end of the year that the utility will say, okay, if you're in a positive position, then we'll agree to, for example, pay you at the avoided cost rate, some small amount. But in most net billing policies, that's not the case, and you just get credited at the net billing rate. The settlement period refers to the time at which the net excess generation credits are trued up or settled. You may remember this from the net metering presentation. Again, this is very similar in many ways to net metering. The most common settlement period is 12 months, and there are a number of different options. In particular, under net billing, you'll see here in B, they essentially receive some further bill credit at the wholesale rate or at the avoided cost rate. So that's the basic logic. Similar to net metering, many of the same design options apply. So in terms of designing a policy, if you're a regulator or a policymaker, it's not about just setting the net billing rate. There's a number of other key design features that make up a net billing policy. So they share many of the same or similar features to net metering. Again, the key difference is it really centers on the compensation rate and the treatment of net excess generation. All of the other components can effectively be very similar to a net metering policy and can be shared with a net metering policy. Now, to get out of the sort of high-level these high-level considerations and policy-level considerations, it's helpful to look at a couple concrete case studies. So I've selected 3. The first is Palau, a small set of islands in the Pacific. Roughly 20,000 inhabitants, annual generation of just under 90 gigawatt hours. Total installed capacity is now somewhere around 40 megawatts. These numbers are a few years outdated. Installed capacity, or the retail electricity tariffs, however, remain in the range for residential customers of 40 cents per kilowatt hour, and for commercial customers around 28 cents per kilowatt hour. And given that it's in the Pacific Islands region, it is fairly sunny, solar resource is quite good, and solar power is becoming increasingly cost competitive there. Now, the payment structure, Palau has adopted a net billing policy, and the payment structure is structured as follows. You can be credited for any net excess generation in a particular month at a rate that's no less than 50% of the tariff applicable during that monthly billing period. So the settlement period here is monthly, not annual. And they effectively say that no less than 50% of the tariff applicable shall be compensated. It shall be compensated at that rate. That means in one of the reasons for this is that in countries like Palau and many island states, the retail rates change quite frequently as a function of oil prices, because islands are often dependent heavily on diesel or heavy fuel oil in the Caribbean, and they ultimately have monthly fluctuations in the power rates. So you see a system here where it's much more closely linked to the utilities' avoided cost of generation, effectively by default. In this case, excess generation is purchased at a significant discount to the retail rate that the customer pays. And again, the idea there is partly to protect the utility and partly to try to achieve some kind of win-win, where it's still financially attractive for the customer, but also financially attractive to the utility. Another case, also from the Pacific Island regions, is found in Vanuatu. Vanuatu is one of the few utilities in the Pacific Islands region that is privatized. The electricity system is largely owned by UNELCO, and they have introduced an interesting policy to govern distributed solar. And you can see here a quick overview of the payment structure. They state explicitly that there's no cash payment, so we're not talking about a feed-in tariff here, we're not talking about a net fit, we are talking about a net billing policy, although it's not, if I'm not mistaken, it's not referred to explicitly as net billing. If I'm not mistaken, they actually call it net metering, but the basic logic is of net billing. On-site generation offsets on-site consumption first, so there is self-consumption. After that, for all net excess generation, that net excess generation offsets 2 components of the bill at a fixed rate. So namely the fixed connection charge, as well as the grid access fee. Only those 2 components of the bill can be erased with net excess generation. And the offsetting rate is fixed within the law at 13.5 US cents per kilowatt hour for every excess kilowatt. So you can really see how sophisticated this gets. It limits the bill. There is ring fencing here. So certain components of the bill are ring fenced, are protected, cannot be erased. And only these 2 specific components of the bill every month can be erased with those net excess kilowatt hours. So that creates an incentive for customers, again, to right size, to design, to not over dimension their solar system, but rather design it to be about the same size as their on-site load. Again, part of the idea here, and what's fascinating about many of these island policies, is that They are, on the one hand, very innovative and very, very unique to their ecosystem, but it's also that you see the effort to try to strike a balance, to try to arrive at some kind of a win-win for both customers as well as for the utility, while diversifying the power mix towards renewable energy and towards more solar power, in this case in particular, in the process. And that striking that balance is going to look differently, is going to be different in every individual case. And finally, our third example here is from the US. In Tucson, Arizona, TEP has recently proposed altering the rate at which it credits solar generation from the retail rate, it used to be a net metering policy, to the rate that they recently paid for a utility scale solar PV project. So here we have yet another variation on net billing, where the rate paid, they basically used as a benchmark, or proposed using as a benchmark, the utility scale solar project that was recently signed. They said that reflects the actual cost of solar on a wholesale basis. We are prepared to use that as a benchmark, and they propose that as a mechanism to credit the net excess generation from household customers. That works out to roughly 5.8 cents per kilowatt hour, or roughly half the current retail rate. So that means if you're a customer, instead of a net metering where you would have gotten, say, 11 cents per kilowatt hour for your net excess generation, now you'll only be credited at 5.8 cents per kilowatt hour, which is a significant change. And again, is yet another sign or clear indicator that net billing policies are often more conservative, more restrictive of the solar sector, but they're also an indicator that solar is getting cheaper and cheaper and is increasingly lower than utility power rates. And that again is a powerful sign of the changes that are taking place within the solar sector more broadly. So a few additional considerations are worth bearing in mind. As we saw, this whole issue of ring fencing is critical, whether a customer can offset all of their bill or only portions of their bill. Under original net metering, it was mostly that you could offset all of your bill. There were no restrictions. This is starting to be tightened in a number of cases. In jurisdictions that have fully volumetric tariffs, so this is basically you get a power bill and all the costs of power distribution, supply, customer service, grid repairs, environmental protection, all of those charges are bundled into one simple per kilowatt hour rate. In those jurisdictions, it's often possible to offset the full retail rate because the way the actual rate is designed. But in jurisdictions where the utility has a more complex rate structure, potentially even with demand charges and other things like that, it is often not possible. And the utility often argues you can only erase certain components of the bill, not others. And that again gives you a hint or an indication of some of the complexity in these policies. Regardless of where you are in the world and regardless of what your utility or your jurisdiction is working towards, every policy is fundamentally a product of its own unique ecosystem. And it's really important to underscore that there are no two net metering, no two net billing policies that are exactly the same. They reflect and they bear the imprint of their unique ecosystem characteristics on them. And you can see this in a range of different areas and range of different design elements, of which this is just one. Another critical consideration is whether customers have to contribute to renewable energy support costs. There are often in a number of jurisdictions, whether in Southeast Asia or here in Europe, in France, Germany, Denmark, specific line items within the power bill that are designed for the renewable energy support. Even in jurisdictions like the Philippines, there are special subsidy categories for low-income residents or for energy efficiency programs or for missionary electrification or even rural electrification programs. One key debate is whether household customers like the net metering or net billing customers should be able to erase their bill and even erase their contribution to these kinds of subsidies within the bill, because these subsidies are designed for very specific public purposes, and utilities often argue that customers shouldn't be able to erase those because they're designed for the public good to support a wide range of different causes. And in a growing number of cases, in fact, those surcharges, those kinds of fees within the bill are being ring-fenced. They cannot be erased. And in other jurisdictions, rather than specifically ring-fencing them, the utilities where those fees don't exist, we're starting to see the emergence of minimum bills. Hawaii, for example, has recently introduced a minimum bill policy with a fixed cost per customer per month, regardless of electricity consumption. And that's essentially the cost of being connected to the utility. One risk with these policies or with these types of designs is that the more and more customers feel like they're being restricted, the cheaper and cheaper solar gets. You have the potential, and the cheaper and cheaper storage gets in particular, you open up the opportunity, you open up the possibility that customers will just start to cut the wire altogether and will start to self-supply all of their power needs. Use solar and batteries to basically supply all of their power. And that would lead to even more revenue loss from the utility if they can't control the rate at which this is happening. So this is yet another reason why the battle or the ongoing struggles over net billing and net metering policies are so fascinating, because they really indicate that we're at a crossroads in the evolution of the power system as distributed generation becomes more cost competitive, becomes more economic, especially as solar storage, as solar plus storage costs continue to go down. There is the opportunity for a growing number of customers to actually cut the wire entirely and self-supply. And that is when that happens, I anticipate that the pendulum is going to swing and utilities will start to be much more willing to strike win-win tariff arrangements, because they will rather hold on to those customers than let them fully slip away. And we're seeing some utilities, in fact, even starting to get into the storage business themselves and starting to offer, even getting into the solar business themselves, so that they can retain a portion of the revenues from that those new market developments and those new business model innovations. So again, the different adaptive strategies here these are ongoing changes. This is a fascinating time and a fascinating landscape to observe evolve in real time. Now, let's shift to a few advantages and challenges. So first, the advantages. On the one hand, net billing recognizes that the cost of solar is increasingly below the cost that customers pay. Hence, paying them or compensating them at the full retail rate is arguably overcompensating. So in that sense, net billing may provide an option for a way to have a fairer compensation structure with fewer cross-subsidization issues. Again, this is a very heated debate, and it's too early to tell, and ultimately the debate depends on what the actual design of the net billing policy is and how restrictive it is. But that's one of the potential advantages of a well-designed net billing policy. A second advantage is that it decouples the compensation of rooftop solar from the customer class that you happen to be in. So it's no longer, if you're a residential customer or a commercial customer or an industrial customer, you're not each getting a different rate for your net excess generation. You are getting, in some cases, the same rate. So it essentially creates a level playing field between the different customers. In that sense, a net billing rate may be less arbitrary than a net metering policy, where a net metering policy, you have a different quote unquote compensation rate for different, depending on which electricity ratepayer class you are actually in. And net billing is in that sense an improvement over that arbitrary compensation structure. Further advantages, it allows utilities to avoid these cross subsidies. Potentially, it makes it easier also to adjust the compensation rate because the net billing rate is not linked to the retail price. Under net metering, once it's net metering, it's fixed and you will get compensated at the retail rate you pay. Net billing makes it possible to actually adjust the net billing rate independently of the retail price that utilities charge their customers. So in a way, there can be two different regulatory processes that happen independently. One of them is the rate setting process for customers. The other is a rate setting process to adjust the net billing rate. And that may make it easier, may have advantages both for the utility and for the industry. Net billing also offers more flexibility as a result in terms of setting the value, quote unquote, of distributed generation to the system, because the net billing rate can be more finely tuned to the actual value of solar to the utility or to the power system. A few additional advantages: enables potentially to mitigate revenue losses, as we saw. It also enables digression, which means customers connecting to the grid in 2018 could get a certain net billing rate, whereas customers connecting in 2019 would get a different net billing rate, and so on. So you have the potential to actually actively track technology cost evolution by setting a different rate. And you can also adjust it based on the evolving value of solar to the system as the market evolves. So there's, again, this flexibility point, the flexibility in setting the rate and adjusting the rate potentially can be a significant advantage. It also may have the unintended effect of encouraging the emergence of new business models that enable customers to trade power with one another. If you are a residential retail customer and you pay 15 cents per kilowatt hour and the utility says, oh, sure, we'll allow you under net billing to get 7 cents back for that net excess generation, you as a customer may well start to look elsewhere to see if maybe your neighbor is interested in buying your net excess generation instead of the utility at a rate that's closer to the retail rate you all pay. This used to not be possible for a host of technological and digital technology and utility regulation reasons, but it's now starting to become possible. There are a number of new platforms and new initiatives in the UK and in Australia and in parts of the US that are looking at peer-to-peer energy sharing, and the possibility that customers could then say, if the net billing rules get too restrictive and the utility isn't compensating them enough, they could start to say, hey, I'm going to start reaching out to my neighbor or to my community, and I'm going to offer these kilowatt hours onto a different kind of exchange and actually fetch the best price. In that sense, the utility is no longer the monopoly buyer, or what's sometimes called the monopsonist, the single buyer in the market. There could be many different buyers for your net excess generation. In that sense, you get more competition, and customers will definitely then be getting, prosumers will definitely then be getting a better rate, a better price for their net excess generation. And that opens up the possibility for a much more dynamic, much more multi-directional, much more interconnected power system than one we've ever known before. And I think we are very much at the beginning of this particular transformation, and I'm excited to see where some of the new businesses and some of the new changes in this particular space take us in the years ahead. A further quick overview of some of the challenges. Customers may find that actually the net billing rate is unfair or is insufficiently high. They may argue that their solar power is worth more than what the utility is prepared to pay for it. It means also that net billing customers are not able to benefit from utility rate increases in quite the same way as they would under net metering, because their rate doesn't track the retail rate increases anymore. And again, net billing is more conservative. It's less, in most cases, less financially attractive than net metering. So these are all some of the downsides to net billing. Now, some key decision points. This list is by no means comprehensive, but it's designed to provide you with a quick overview of some of the key decisions that if you're a policymaker, a regulator, someone who's involved in developing or adjusting your policy for distributed solar, these are some of the considerations you should be looking at. These are some of the key design features and decision points that need to be made. Now, a few concluding remarks. There's broadly a trend towards compensation being set below the retail rate, as we saw, and that change is embodied by the emergence of net billing policies. We're seeing ring fencing becoming more common, limiting certain components of the bill, and we're also seeing net fits becoming more common as an evolution even beyond net billing itself. And we're starting to see a growing number of jurisdictions moving rather in that direction. And for a closer or deeper look, in particular at net fits, I encourage you to take a look at session 7, specifically on that topic, and also to have a look at session 2, which provides an overall snapshot of solar policy and looks at a few different policy tools. On the one hand, net billing can help address utility concerns around revenue loss. And in that sense, if utilities are deemed to be a necessary part of the future of the power system, having more financially solvent, financially stable utilities may actually be positive in the long run for the long-term growth of distributed solar. So there may be, again, the idea here that most jurisdictions are trying to strive towards is some kind of a win-win, where customers can gain, solar prosumers can gain and can benefit, and the utility can still remain financially solvent and maintain reliable, secure power supply for all its customers. However, as I pointed out a few moments ago, net billing may also foreshadow the rise of more disruptive business models in the future. The tighter and the more restrictive the regulatory environment for customer-sited solar becomes, the more likely it is that these new business models break through and gain very rapidly very large numbers of customers. In particular, models like peer-to-peer power sharing. As we saw in the net metering presentation, the genie is arguably out of the bottle, and there's very little that we can do to change that. The fundamental economics are now in solar's favor, and it's up to policymakers and regulators in conjunction with utilities and with citizens to design and develop better policies that, again, try to achieve these win-wins and try to arrive at a system where solar power can flourish as a cost-competitive, clean source of new power generation, and where the utility system as a whole can continue to provide reliable electricity supply for all. With that, I want to thank you very much for your attention and for following through the presentation, and hope you were able to learn something more about distributed solar policy in the process. I've added here a list of further reading at the end, including a number of recent reports and analyses that have been published, and I want to thank you for your time, and I encourage you to take, at the end of this, there was a few brief questions as the knowledge test that essentially is there to gauge your knowledge and test essentially whether you've grasped the essentials of these different policy tools. So with that, thank you very much and wishing you all a great day.